Good afternoon and welcome everyone to today's webinar. I see people are still rolling in and joining us in this session, but I think I'll kick us off as we've gone slightly past 4 o'clock our time. So welcome to the session today. Thank you for joining us. I'm Sarah Goodyear, the Monitoring, Evaluation and Learning Officer based at Senfree. And today we're focusing on the topic of designing demand-side surveys and some very important considerations about good survey design practices and the key importance of piloting surveys for meaning. We have a great lineup of speakers for you today who will be sharing their expertise. And to guide us through the session, please welcome our facilitator, Isabel Carboni. Isabel is the Insight to Impact Measurement Lead and a Senior Engagement Manager at Senfree. So over to you, Isabel.
Thank you, Sarah. Let me just check you can all hear me okay.
Yes.
Sarah, you can hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you well.
Okay. All right, well, welcome everybody to our Open Eye-to-Eye webinar number 2, Designing a Demand-Side Survey, What You Need to Know Before You Begin. So Insight to Impact is a global resource center that seeks to improve financial inclusion through smarter use of data. We were launched in 2015 and jointly hosted by Senfree and Finmark Trust, with funding from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and the MasterCard Foundation. Eye-to-Eye is coming to an end this year, so we decided to launch the Open Eye-to-Eye initiative to give both Senfree and Finmark Trust the opportunity to share some of the learnings of the things we've discovered over the last 5 years of the Eye-to-Eye program. So we've launched this Open Eye-to-Eye series with Next Billion since last October to share some of these learnings to the audience. So we'll hope you enjoy the learnings we have to share today on the demand-side surveys. So this Open Eye-to-Eye webinar will focus specifically around designing good surveys. What are the best practices for demand-side surveys, and the importance of piloting your surveys and using types of techniques like cognitive testing to really make sure that your survey respondents understand the questions correctly to get the best possible data. So we have some good practices and principles to share with you and how to ensure quantitative surveys really resonate properly with the respondents. A couple of quick housekeeping points before we begin. You'll see there's a question and answer function on the Zoom, so please do put your questions there so then we can be ready to answer them for you. And then we'll address all of the questions at the end of the webinar. Now, without further ado, I'll introduce to you our first presenter, which is Iska van der Berg. She is an associate with Senfree, and by that we mean that we have worked in partnership together for a long time. She has a huge amount of experience in doing cognitive testing and qualitative research. She is the owner of a market research company and is a qualitative research specialist, and her firm focuses on consumer interviews to understand the challenges that consumers face in using the services of different providers. So Iska, over to you.
Thank you. Just share my screen. Sarah, just confirm, is it on?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Today I would like to discuss the experience that my company and the Plain Language Institute had with ensuring that quantitative surveys resonate with the respondents. Now, I'm sure most of you who've ever used quantitative figures sometimes looked at the figures and said, this does not make sense. Now, I'd like to put the question to you. If that happens, and the questions and the figures don't make sense. The figures don't make sense. What do? Just think about that for a moment. We have gone and asked users of quantitative figures. And they told us the first thing that they do is they triangulate. Then they do more analysis to see if the strange figures, if they can figure out what's going on. And then they often scrutinize the sample. Maybe the explanation is somewhere there. And if they're still not able to figure out what's going on, then they rationalize. We have never heard, however, that these users said, when there's an anomaly, they wonder whether the question itself potentially inhibited the respondents to report properly on their reality. I'm going to illustrate that to you using COVID as an example. Here is a poster by the World Health Organization that explains to people how to wash their hands. We've all heard that now. But they didn't, I don't know what the population focus was, but all of us need to wash our hands. And if you look at these two different realities and potentially target markets of that poster, very different realities. Just look at the Tippy Tap user on the right. That is a soap. This bottle is the tap. This here at the bottom is the basin. Now, if a Tippy Tap user had to look at this poster and see this picture here on the left, she wouldn't know that that is actually meant to be a basin, or that the second circle here is a soap dispenser. If you were to put in a questionnaire questions about this poster and ask specifically about soap, she wouldn't recognize this from her point, her frame of reference, that this is actually soap. She will answer, because in a survey, you always get an answer, but the answer will in all probability be completely inappropriate. Now, in a quantitative survey, a pilot should identify problematic questions, but this does not always happen. And you'll get a link there that explains the underlying problem. Quantitative companies often do process pilots, and they do not test the understanding of questions in depth. Bobby will talk to this a bit later. We have developed a methodology. We call it cognitive action research, in an attempt to improve data integrity. We're using different information from different disciplines. The one is cognitive interviewing methodology, which many of you would be familiar with. That has been around for a long time to assist questionnaire designers to get the interview, or get the questions as best as possible. But we've added to that insights from qualitative interviewing, action research, and this figure here at the left describes it. So you test, you analyze, and then you revise and you test again. So it's a continual process. And then from plain language, there you see the description of plain language. That is used in many countries in the world. And back to our Tippy Tap user, if you do something in plain language, she would understand what those pictures represent if you had done it in plain language. And then we also used reading processing strategy. So if someone reading an English text and it's a foreign language user, what strategies do they use to make sense of that text? Now, our first study was to test some of FinScope's SMS survey. So this was not the big FinScope study, it was an SMS survey, so it was therefore a new study that we could test before it went into field. They used some of the questions of FinScope, and also some of the poverty index questions was on there. Because it was SMS survey, the questions were short because you were limited to 144 characters. There's the link if you want to read the complete information on that study. I'm going to tell you about some of it. The survey questionnaire was fairly straightforward, and I'm sure many of these questions you will recognize. It's not complex questions. I mean, how many people are living in the household? It's not complex questions. The test that we have used is we had a qualitative interviewer interviewing one individual respondent. At the beginning, we had an informal chat, put the respondent at ease, and also got some background information which we could use to verify the information that they gave on the SMS questionnaire. Then the respondent completed the SMS questionnaire without any assistance. But before we did the cognitive interview, we explained to the respondent that they must help us to make sure that the questionnaire can be understood by other people like themselves. So we're not there to judge them. Normally people wouldn't be happy to say, I didn't have the foggiest idea what they were asking me, or I don't understand that word. But after we've explained their role in the process, they really participated very well. And then once we explored, we tested each question. We probed it separately to understand exactly what's going on. So that is the test phase that we did. Then next, the analysis. We debriefed each interviewer immediately after each round. In the end, we did 5 rounds, and after every session, we debriefed. We unpacked in detail why respondents answered the way they did, and I will go through with you now the typical types of problems that respondents experience that we found when we analyzed. There were mainly 2 types of inappropriate responses. The one was that there is a mismatch between the respondent's interpretation of the question and what the questionnaire designer intended. Think about the 2 pictures that I showed you if you were to ask about soap. So there's that mismatch about their reality. And then there were also responses that resulted from a complete or partial incomprehension what was being asked. Now here is an example. The objective of this question was to find out how many children of school-going age was in the household. That was part of the poverty index question. The question was fairly simple. How many children between the ages of 6 and 12 are living in your household? And then here were all the response options. This question gave problems across all rounds, even after we had revised. Only about half of the respondents in total answered this question correctly. Now, the types of problems that they experienced were like structural. They counted all the children. They saw how many children, counted the number of children, not between the ages of 6 and 12. The logic they misinterpreted between 6 and 12. I mean, do you include 6? Do you exclude 6? What's going on? Sometimes they got confused and thought, oh, I don't have a child of 6 or I don't have a child of 12. They wanted to circle here or indicate, yes, I've got a child of 2 and a child of 6, and of course the SMS questionnaire it doesn't give you that opportunity. They didn't know which children should be considered, siblings who should be considered, and many of them didn't know the ages of the children. So we got responses to all of this. You always get a response when you ask a survey. An SMS questionnaire, you can't carry on if you don't respond. But in most cases, you wouldn't have been able to use those quantitative figures. Then, so after we've analyzed it, then we revised it. We used specifically plain language tools and techniques to address the issues. Some questions, small change was possible. Sometimes we had to deconstruct it totally. Sometimes delete it, and some were added. And Kate will explain to you the thinking also, or the experience in some of the studies that we've done with it. This is not a call that we as researchers can make. The interaction with the client to make sure that the questionnaire addresses the objectives is crucial. I mean, we can't throw out a question if that is part of their main objective. So that liaison was very important. And then we went round and round and did 5 rounds. Here's an example of a version where we completely deconstructed it. The objective of this was client wanted to find out, have you ever used a mobile money service? And they started to give that description of what is a mobile money service. In our final version, we deconstructed it in 3 completely different questions. Do you use your phone to buy or pay for anything? Do you send money on your phone? And do you receive money on your phone? Sarah can share with you the process of the different rounds, how we changed every time. The impact of this research, it was really a shocking eye-opener. The reduction in the inappropriate answers was really dramatic. Have a look at this graph. In the first round, about half of the people either gave inappropriate answers or they had no idea what was being asked. If this was a real survey, you might as well save the trouble and the money to go and do the survey and just flip a coin, because only half of those answers you would be able to reliably use. After 5 rounds, it improved dramatically. There were still some responses where we got inappropriate answers or where people didn't understand. I don't think you'll ever get it right. If we had more rounds, that question on how many children in the household is one example. We still didn't crack it. So if you had more rounds, we would have decreased that. But I think there will always be a small percentage where you don't get exactly the right or the appropriate answers. Now, the implication for the data integrity is quite obvious. If this was an actual survey with a big sample size, and you've paid a lot of money for that, half of those responses on that survey would have been inappropriate or arbitrary answers. But more important is if you wanted to use the results of that survey to make strategic decisions, policymakers and stakeholders might have based their decisions on data without integrity. So the risk is immense. Since we've done that first study, we've done a number of other studies for I2I, Genesis Analytic, and Senfree, and Kate will talk about some of the Senfree work. We've also used it with multi-choice to test and fine-tune the concepts to use in a conjoint analysis. You can understand if people don't understand your concept, then your conjoint analysis is null and void. We're at the moment busy testing the water and sanitation questions for the South African census. We're doing that for the Water Research Commission, and we're continually improving as we go along. You would think that we would be so skilled at this point to just take a questionnaire and be able to put it in appropriate answers, and it's not. Every time we realize just how important it is to test it with the actual target marker. Lastly, just a few practicalities. How many rounds is required depends on the complexity of the questionnaire and whether people answered appropriately or not. Bobby will also talk to that. It takes between, let's say, 2 and 6 weeks, again, depending. We have tested translated questionnaires in Rwanda and in Kenya. And Bobby will also explain to you, if you were to test it amongst different countries and different cultures, the implications of that. And yes, in the COVID time, we can do remote testing. We have done it with field worker briefings and debriefings on Zoom, and interviewers doing telephone. Right, so I'm going to stop sharing now and hand back to Isabel.
Super, thank you, Iska. And now we're going to move on to Bobby. Bobby, are you ready? Bobby is a researcher with Insight to Impact data for financial inclusion team that's based at Finmark Trust. Bobby focuses specifically on demand-side surveys and has been with Insight to Impact since 2015. Bobby, over to you.
Great, thanks very much, Isabel and Iska. So as Iska's introduced, our focus today is very much on best demand-side survey questionnaire practices, but we really are trying to showcase something that we focused on at Insight to Impact, and as you've seen has been carried forward. And this was this whole idea of developing questions for meaning and deconstructing the different aspects that need to happen in doing in putting a questionnaire together, and really figuring out where the pressure points are that are going to make the biggest difference. And so Iska's given you a really good overview of her approach to cognitive action research, and I'll take a little bit further in terms of the cognitive interviewing process, just as one part of the questionnaire design process. So obviously when it comes to sort of questionnaire design, it fits into an entire demand side survey. There are a whole bunch of tasks that need to be done. What is shown is that just looking at one part of the process of really getting the questionnaire wording right is a big, it's a big process in itself, and can almost be seen as a mini project that needs to be given appropriate consideration and emphasis to really get a lot out of it. So I'm going to talk about managing sort of big study task and looking at the cognitive interview from the organization that's actually doing the study. Obviously, Iska is taking on the role of the researcher that's actually implementing the work. And then from there, I'm going to take a step back to talk about overall key study design principles for getting questionnaire meaning and wording, and then give you some examples of question challenges that, just to take a little bit further, and a bridge between Iska and Kate that Iska's already introduced some, and Kate's going to give you some other good practical examples. So, as Iska was saying, there are projects where cognitive interviewing can take place in multiple countries and multiple languages. And if you think about doing this optimally, I mean, there are different approaches that can be done. You could do it in series where you do one country, and then you say that country must go off and implement its questionnaire, and learnings can then be implemented in doing cognitive interviewing in another country. We did a project where we took the iterative approach that Iska was talking about, where you learn a bit from testing the questionnaire wording in the first round, and you go back and you improve the question wording, and then you test it again. And obviously, there's a point, as Iska was saying, at which you're not really going to get much more improvement. There's always some kind of error in understanding on the respondent side, but you can definitely take a few rounds to improve that question to a very large extent. But instead of just doing it in one country, let's say in English, we did a project that was implemented in Kenya, in Tanzania, Uganda, and Pakistan. There's obviously greater similarities between the East African countries compared to Pakistan, but they each have they each have their own sort of their own language groups, and there are always idioms in terms of how people understand even a language like English. So the key thing over here is obviously Iska has got incredible experience in doing cognitive interviewing, but the kind of expertise that you have on the ground differs from country to country. So the first point I want to emphasize here is that you need to look at the country and institution partner capacity limits. We did a lot of background research in terms of who could do the work in each country, and some countries don't actually have in-country cognitive interviewing experience. And it might seem like cognitive interviewing is just another application of qualitative research, but it really is a very refined skill and requires a lot of experience and thought, because it's not just about asking people how they feel about dishwashing soap, whatever the case is. It really is getting to the sense of, are these people understanding the meaning that's coming out of the question? Do they, as Iska was emphasizing, do they interpret the question in the way that I want them to? So beyond just having that capacity, as Iska was showing, her and her partners integrate a number of different ways of exploring information and questions. And so it's very important to know beforehand, what approaches are you going to implement in general? And then when it comes to each question, what are the appropriate ways to explore a respondent's meaning for that particular question? Because sometimes you might be wanting to look at one kind of cognitive interviewing approach, and sometimes you might want to look at something different. When you're working in multiple countries, it's really then important to get to coordinate the different research partners very well. And either the organization that's doing the research needs to take the lead, or they need to nominate a particular organization that is going to make sure that things flow appropriately in each market, and that there's clear responsibilities. These might seem obvious for any kind of mini research project, but it's really important, once again, especially when you've got the complexity of multiple countries and multiple languages. The next thing to emphasize is that cognitive interviewing is not just like any other qualitative research. As we've emphasized, there are a number of ways to gain from doing the work iteratively. And that means that whoever's going to do it needs to be, and fund it, needs to be prepared that it actually is more costly than you might think from any other typical qualitative research. If you are interviewing 6 people in a round, you're going to multiply that by potentially 3 rounds, and you've already got 18 one-on-one interviews. And that's just to make sure that you get an optimal question wording. The next thing that, again, Iska was emphasizing is that the outputs need to align with the study objectives. So Iska was presenting cognitive action research from the perspective of the research company. And in terms of us that are commissioning the research and then managing the entire research, it's really important to make sure that we're very engaged, so that we don't leave key decisions up to the research company and then turn around and say, I didn't want you to do this. It's ultimately our responsibility to make sure that the researchers are delivering on what we want. And if they go in a particular direction, we just need to bring them back in and say, the question that you are coming up with makes sense to the respondent, but this is what we ultimately want to measure. So let's look for a different approach to get there. So that's just talking about the cognitive interviewing and getting the meaning as one part of the mini project in the entire questionnaire design and questionnaire wording process. But in general, there are a number of key things that apply to all different processes that are undertaken. So up front, it's really important to make sure that the overall study goals and deliverables are well known and clear. And that then also comes into who is the population that you're going to focus on, what is the sampling approach that you're going to take. And when it comes to something like cognitive interviewing, that will then make it very clear who should be interviewed and what exactly what kind of questions exactly we're interested in looking at. Once you know your study goals, it's really important to identify the indicators that you're going to cover to make sure that that ultimately you achieve those study goals. And here there needs to be discipline. So particularly in the age of COVID, we're becoming more aware that you can't do face-to-face interviewing. And in the past, we would torture respondents by sometimes making them do 2-hour interviews and sort of covering everything that we would ever want to ask. But if you're moving to remote interviewing, whether it's telephonic or SMS or whatever the case is, you become far more aware that people's attention spans drift, and that if the interview is too long, they'll just hang up on you, and then you're losing valuable information, and it's costly. You still have to pay for the time of people that are interviewing. So it's really important to be disciplined in terms of what your goals are, and then how that feeds into the particular indicators that you cover. And in terms of identifying those indicators, it's very important to make sure that you get the key information that you need. If you're ultimately going to influence policymakers or, let's say, financial services providers, whoever your audience is, make sure you speak to those stakeholders. You really understand what they're interested in, and then you get a good sense of where and how to prioritize. And if you don't know so much about your topic, so we've done research into gender and financial inclusion, and that's not something that I personally have a very big evidence base on. So we did an entire mini project even before the cognitive interviewing process with experts around the world in terms of if we're trying to get financial inclusion relevant indicators of, let's say, women's economic empowerment, what are the kinds of things we should be looking into in there, and then how do we prioritize before we actually come up with the questions. So once you've identified your indicators, then it's time to turn those indicators into questions. And the sort of key points to think about here are: make those questions simple, make them brief, make them clear, and that the understanding is clear. And then also make sure that the concepts that you test are singular, they don't confuse respondents. And Iska provided a very good example in her presentation where the underlying indicator was on digital financial services usage, or which can in one way be simplified in if it's appropriate in a country like Kenya or Uganda, where most digital financial services are mobile money, then it's mobile money usage. And you could see that something like mobile money usage to us might seem like a singular concept, but when we actually do plain language work and do cognitive interviewing, we see that it can be a few concepts that get bundled into one, and it's important to then split those into the underlying questions. Have you ever used mobile money? Do you have your own mobile money account? Have you used your account in the past 3 months? As an example. The next thing to think about is, what is your intended use? Is this going to be a survey that doesn't feed into anything else? It can be compartmentalized and sort of seen as a standalone work. If that's the case, you have a lot more leeway. But if you're trying to use it to compare to other countries, as an example, or to compare to data that's been collected in the past, and with the work that Iska did with SMS, here we were trying to take work on digital financial services that have been collected in another survey and compare it going forward, collected through something like an SMS mode. So there it's really important that you need to either compare it to other countries, or you need to compare it to data that you've collected beforehand, and you want to make sure that there's a trend line that you can continue going forward. So if it's a standalone, you can be as specific as you want to, and you can really make sure that the idiosyncrasies of the country and the population you're looking at can be catered for. But if you're making it comparable to, let's say, other countries, then there needs to be some kind of generalizability, and that's really important when you're coming up with your questions and when you're doing appropriate processes such as cognitive interviewing and potentially, let's say, multi-country management. The next thing is the art of interpretation. So this is once you've actually got your data. And I like to use the example of COVID, where what we're finding with COVID is people can see just how sensitive analysis can be based on when the data is collected. Was it before COVID? Well, what was the world like before COVID? Is it after COVID? Okay, had lockdown been implemented? And at what part of the lockdown are we? Because obviously, we know in a country like South Africa and lots of other countries that there's easing of restrictions at different levels. And so it could be, let's say we're asking a question about drinking alcohol, for example. In South Africa at the moment, you can't buy alcohol. A week ago you could. 3 months ago you couldn't. So your questions are going to be really sensitive to a number of different things. It could be, and so the interpretation, you always need to contextualize really well. And this comes down into, let's say, when you're comparing against other countries. Okay, so those are some general principles about questionnaire study design and linking to what we think is really important work with cognitive interviewing for getting meaning. Now, in terms of some examples that we've had, I was just talking about comparability of indicator tracking. What's really important over here is that if you're trying to track indicators that have been covered somewhere else, it's really important that you fully understand the construct that you're interested in covering. Is this, going back to digital financial services, is this about any usage of a digital financial services, a digital enabled account in the past 3 months? Or are we only interested in certain transactions? Let's say, are we trying to rule out people that were buying airtime, which is in some markets the most prevalent use of digital financial services? So how do we best cover, let's say in a new survey, and it could be over SMS or over the telephone, how do we best cover exactly the constructs that we're interested in? So there's different kinds of validities, and construct is one of those. The next thing is something that Iska also mentioned, and this is literacy and character limitations. So if you're going to do an SMS survey, the person that is going to respond to your survey needs to be able to read. But of course, it's really important in a country like Pakistan, there are certain languages that are more prevalent than the language of instruction. The language of instruction is Urdu, but when it comes to reading, people are more likely to understand something written in Urdu than something written in Parsi, for instance. So you really have to understand what is the language that you're going to administer the survey in, and then how do you best construct your questions so that as many people will understand it as possible. And if it's going to be on SMS, how do you construct your question that the question wording and the responses all fit into 160 characters? And so cognitive interviewing plays a really good role there. The next thing relates to social norms and country contextualization. So we did a survey in a number of different countries, East Africa and Pakistan. We were very interested because it was a gender-related survey in people's relationship status. In many countries, including the East African ones, you can ask people whether they are currently living with their partner or not with their partner. But in Pakistan, if somebody lives with a partner, they're going to be married. And it's actually socially inappropriate to ask people if they're living with someone but are unmarried. So a marital status question makes far more sense. So we did a survey that was comparable in many, many respects across the different countries, but in certain questions such as marital status, it did need to be contextually different. The next thing relates to researcher intention versus respondent interpretation. And here I'm going to echo something else that Iska raised, and this is that we can come up with a question that doesn't really work. So we're doing a COVID tracker at the moment. One of the questions we're interested in is care work, because obviously we're interested in gender differences as well as how the different levels of lockdown have affected care work in people's houses. So we asked a question like, how many hours did you spend yesterday caring for someone in your household? A lot of people are responding 24 hours. Now that's not what we want people to answer. And we can understand why someone would say, yeah, I spent the whole day with somebody that I'm caring for. And this just shows that we didn't have the luxury of doing cognitive interviewing. We needed to collect information as soon as possible to understand what's going on with COVID. But this is a question where cognitive interviewing would make a big difference in coming up with something that was better worded. Just in terms of general questionnaire principles, this is a link in terms of a guide we came up with a few years ago on the I2I facility. And it covers a lot of things in broad detail. Here, obviously, we're focusing on getting questions for meaning. That's all from me, and I know that there's more to do, so I'm going to pass it back to Isabel. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bobby. That's great, and I think some good guidance there from both Iska and Bobby around simplicity and making those questions really easy to answer for people. If we don't get good data, we're not going to come up with appropriate approaches or responses. Just one thing to add there, we've really appreciated working with Iska over the years, and we've often been quite surprised by some of the mistakes that we make as researchers creating questions compared to how people understand that. So just to really underline the value of this, I'm going to hand over to Kate to talk about how that adds value particularly. Thank you, Kate.
Sure. Thanks so much, Isabel, and thanks, Bobby and Iska, for the great presentations. I'm going to try to marry the two a bit and just give you a little bit of insight into some of the experiences that I, as a researcher, have had working with Iska and doing cognitive testing over the last year. I've been quite lucky in the fact that I've been able to do this type of testing in 3 different instances. All of these instances were because we wanted to roll out a quantitative survey, but before doing so, we really wanted to make sure that respondents understood the questions that we were asking. I have to say I was quite terrified at first when Iska said, if you don't do the cognitive testing, it could be just as good as flipping a coin, 50-50. So I think I'm just going to share a little bit of insight into one specific project that we did this with, and just kind of explain to you how some of the questions changed and the logic behind them. So this past year, we worked with a construction platform in Kenya called iBuild. They connect homeowners, contractors, building suppliers, and workers on a digital app. And they were interested in asking the question, how can they, as a digital platform, improve the livelihoods of their users and offer relevant financial services on their platform? So we had the task of conducting consumer research, both qualitative research and quantitative research, with their user groups in order to understand, who are these individuals? So what are their demographics? What are their business operations? So if you're a contractor or you're a building supplier, you're obviously operating on the platform as probably a small and medium enterprise, not really as an individual. You employ other people. What are these individuals' goals, aspirations? What are the risks and constraints they face, and how do they typically cope with these risks and constraints? So we designed different quantitative surveys for each user group. And, because we were interested in understanding more about, who these individuals were and how they operate as a business, there were 2 specific questions that we wanted to ask contractors. And, you know, as the researcher, I thought these are very simple questions. I mean, you know, they're worded simply. I'm sure I'll get back the answers quite quickly, and, you know, they won't misunderstood. And I also thought that because we had done qualitative research before designing the quantitative survey, I thought that, you know, we had enough insight into who these individuals were and kind of how they operated and terminology that they used to be able to seamlessly design a questionnaire. Little did I know that those two specific questions were actually quite challenging. So the first one was, you know, if you're designing financial service products for a user group, you want to know what is their spending power? So what is their income? So we asked the question, how much money do you earn on average each month? We got Iska and her team from the Plain Language Institute here in South Africa to do the cognitive testing over 2 different rounds with contractors on that specific question. And it turned out that that was a horribly designed question. And these are kind of the reasons why. So first of all, average, what does that mean? The contractors thought, is this the most amount of money they've made? Is this the smallest amount? You know, what does average mean? Then there were many contractors who actually weren't willing to answer that question. I mean, it's quite a personal question, asking how much money someone makes. So that was another thing. Many people opted out of the question. And then you have things like, is this before expenses or after expenses? And then you had things like availability bias. Many individuals would think about, you know, the past month or two, and that's what they would base their answer on, even though that their income and the amount that they made each month changed monthly. So we actually, in the end, had to scrap that question completely because the answers that we were getting back were just very varied. And it was quite clear that each individual that we asked this question to interpreted slightly different. So if we were to take those results and then compare them to each other in a quantitative survey, we would actually be giving quite misleading data and insights. And, you know, you just want to make sure that you aren't designing financial service products or policy around data, which is quite inaccurate. Another example that we had, and I think this was quite an interesting one for me because I also thought that it was pretty straightforward, which was, you know, how many people work for you permanently and are paid? So we asked that of contractors because we wanted to get an understanding of how big their businesses were and how formal they were. The challenging thing here was that many of the people that we did the cognitive testing with said, okay, well, if a family member works for me, are they someone that is an employee? I mean, I pay them from time to time, but not all the time, but they are permanent. Then you have then many individuals also interpreted it as anyone who worked for them. So whether they're part-time or full-time, it didn't actually matter. And then, you know, a really big thing is that in construction, the work is seasonal. So sometimes you employ more people for a specific season than you do for others. And you also, sometimes you have larger contracts and you employ 8 people for a specific contract, but then you might have a smaller one where you employ 1 person. So in the end, we also had to scrap this question. And I think it's not that we weren't able to measure these types of things in the end. It's just that we had to ask very different questions, which people could actually answer and then make some inferences based on those. So in terms of income, instead of asking the income question, we asked things like, you know, what was the value of the biggest contract you had in the last year? How long did it take you to complete this contract? What was the value of the smallest contract that you completed in the last year? And how long did that take? How many contracts do you typically complete in a year? How many are you working on now? So while this is not a perfect measure of income or the number of employees, it does give some insight into their turnover and, you know, how many people that they are employing is likely to be based on how large the contracts are. So I think that this is just to highlight the importance of doing this type of testing. And I think that Iska and Bobby did a great job of kind of talking you through how you do that. One thing that they did flag is that it can be expensive and it can take time because typically you're talking about testing your survey with 2 different groups of individuals, probably about 10 individuals in each group. And so that obviously does take time and cost money. I mean, if you, for instance, can't do this type of testing, at the very least, I would suggest that you test the survey with someone who's not involved in the research project, because oftentimes they can also point out clear things that other people might misinterpret. And I realize that this is not a perfect solution, because you really want to be testing the survey with individuals who fit the same sample that you'll be surveying. But in the sake of time and in the sake of cost, that's just a simple thing that one can do to try to avoid some of these biases and misinterpretations and misunderstandings that you get in quantitative surveys. But yeah, I think that it's at SynFree and Eye to Eye, I think it's been really beneficial to be able to do this type of cognitive testing. And as a researcher, going through the process and sitting in the interviews and hearing the feedback from the individuals who are helping you with this is also really thought-provoking and helps you in the design of your future surveys. But Isabel, I think I'm going to hand back over to you at this stage so we can allow some time for questions.
Super, thank you. Sarah, I'm just going to look to you for a second in case there have been any questions in the Q&A, but I'll get going in the meantime as well. So I think one key thing we've really learned through this process at Eye to Eye is that piloting your surveys for meaning is an often neglected but a really vital element of designing a good demand-side survey. If people don't understand what it is you're asking, you're never going to get good data. And we really can't underestimate how often that can happen so easily when we are focused on measuring particular indicators, how our phrasing is, without thinking about how that individual will actually respond to that question. And if they will feel comfortable answering that question, does it make sense in that particular context? So really taking that people-centered approach or that customer-centered approach to designing the surveys and really thinking that through. So while piloting to get the process right is also key, if the questions are not understood by the respondent in that context, the survey is not going to be an accurate reflection of what you want to measure and may lead us to wrong conclusions. So that's been an important learning for us through this process. A comedy aside is that we've even had issues with questions like, are you male or female? Where those terms may not make any sense in the context at all. And could have just asked, are you a man or are you a woman? So it's sometimes we can be tripped up by even those seemingly simple questions that can lead you to wrong conclusions. Another one that is often used now in SMS surveys or computer-assisted telephone surveys is around usage of mobile money. And from our perspective, we might want to know, do you use mobile money? Whereas that might not be the term that people are using. So finding out things, in one case we ended up with something like money you keep on your phone. So there are always these nuances that may lead people to say, no, I don't use mobile money, because that's not a term that they're familiar with. So thank you again to Iska and to Bobby and to Kate for sharing. If I might just ask our three panelists to think about, in your experience of working on demand-side surveys, if you could only say one thing, one takeaway for our listeners today, what would you say is the most important thing for someone designing a demand-side survey to remember, if nothing else? What would that be? Maybe I'll ask Iska first.
I always want to come up for the customer. Customer centricity is a word that is used so frequently. And often I would say when surveys are being designed or when people interpret the results and they say, I would say, but you're not thinking of the customer. And the best way to to understand the customer and to understand the customer's context is to do really good qualitative research before you design a quantitative questionnaire. Spoken like a true qualitative researcher.
Super. Thank you, Iska. Bobby, what would be your one takeaway for people listening in?
Sorry, I see I'm on mute. Be very clear with what your objectives are. It's sort of the discipline, the clarity, the prioritization of what you want to know, ultimately. It helps to narrow in and focus, and it allows for you to have a sort of shorter set of questions to then give to a researcher like Iska to make sure that the questions are asked properly.
So Bobby and Iska, I'm a little sad you guys both went first because those are the two things that I would have highlighted. So, you need to think like your customer, and really to do that, you need to speak to them. I mean, I'm always a proponent of doing, even if it's a small amount, but just a little bit of qualitative research before you design your survey to explore the realities that they live in. I mean, especially if you're doing a quantitative survey that has multiple choice answers. If you give them irrelevant answers, it doesn't fit their context. You're going to get wrong responses, and a lot of times you'll find that you add questions and add responses and remove some, and you only find that out through the initial qualitative research. And the other thing is, remember that consumers have response fatigue. I think Bobby's point around really understanding what your objective is and your research question. I mean, that's really key. Don't ask a bunch of things that are nice to have. If you do that, you find you might be like me and end up with a 30-question survey when really you should have 10. But I think just try to keep the consumer, your research objective in mind, and your consumer in mind, and put yourself in their shoes. They don't want to answer 35 questions over an hour. They want to do it in 10 minutes. So yeah, just that would be my advice.
Super. Thank you, Kate. Bobby, we have one question in the chat that perhaps you might be best to answer, which is, which models are available for studying cash transfer effects at intra-household and national level?
Okay, I'm going to try. I must admit, this is probably an example where I'd say get a panel of experts together before going forward, because I don't have the exact subject expertise in it. I can say that I've seen some interesting mobile money research in Uganda. I think it was with BRAC that sort of looked at the empowerment effects on women business owners of getting a mobile money sort of equipped phone. So, I mean, I think whenever it comes to this kind of research, things are changing all the time in terms of actually really understanding how things work. And I suppose there probably are different approaches across sociology or psychology that you can look at sort of saying, this is actually how I think things work, and I'm going to design questionnaires appropriately. But with the big caveat that this is not an area of expertise, sort of inter-household bargaining dynamics, and when it comes to sort of mobile money or cash transfers, and it's a great example of really sort of doing the background research before coming up with the questions.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Bobby. Kate, did you want to add anything on this? Or Iska?
I think that Bobby did a good job of answering it, so nothing to add further from mine.
Thank you. So a good example of when qualitative work would be really critical to understand what types of intra-household effects there might be in order to go deeper on that. Are there any other questions, Sarah? I don't see any more here. All right, super. All right. Well, thank you everybody for joining us today. If you'd like to learn any more about the methods that were presented today, please do use copy those links in the chat that we have here that Sarah has put there. And do feel free to get in touch with Iska on cognitive testing and piloting for meaning, or get in touch with Bobby on demand-side surveys and getting the process right, especially for multi-country contexts. Or get in touch with Kate on working with providers for better understandings of their contexts. Thank you very much for joining us today, and enjoy the rest of your day or your evening. Thank you to all of our panelists for joining us too.
Thanks. Bye.